In the late 18th and early 19th century, a self-education movement for adults developed across the United Kingdom. The lit and film movement was initially reserved exclusively for the gentry, wealthy gentlemen, and those in professions such as academia, the clergy, medicine, and dentistry. The Royal Institution, the Linnean Society, and the Zoological Society followed on from the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufacture and Commerce, and the Royal Academy of Art. Similar organisations began to appear in Edinburgh and Dublin. The first to be formed in the provinces of England was the Manchester Literary and Philosophical Society in March 1781. The organisation we know today as the Plymouth Athenaeum was founded formally as the Plymouth Institute on the 17th of October 1812, but was soon renamed the Plymouth Institution. And forgive me if sometimes I move interchangeably between Plymouth Institution and Athenaeum. It depends on the context of the time. A related movement had also been gaining strength: public subscription libraries. These include the Tavistock Subscription, Plymouth Proprietary, and the Morab of Penzance. By the 1820s, the movement began to spread to the skilled and working classes. Mechanics institutes were inspired by the beliefs of philanthropists such as Lord Brougham and George Birkbeck, who believed that through education, moral improvement could be instilled in the working classes. Such institutes were established in all major towns and cities across the country. Lectures and classes on the physical sciences, engineering, and technical matters took place. Later, the humanities, such as moral philosophy and literature, would be taught. Some subjects were taboo, however: politics and religion. The first attempt to create a local mechanics institute came on Thursday, the 10th of March, 1825, at the Town Hall, Devonport. A meeting took place to form the Plymouth, Devonport and Stonehouse Mechanics Institute. Its object, Samuel Rowe revealed in Panorama of Plymouth, was to be the diffusion of scientific knowledge among those who are employed in the various branches of practical mechanics. Rowe, vicar, bookseller and antiquarian, was a member of the Plymouth Institution in the mid-1800s and well placed to record the times. The New Monthly Magazine reported, "A meeting of the inhabitants of Plymouth was held at the Guildhall for the purposes of establishing a mechanics institute in that town. Nearly 400 persons were present to report progress and submit a code of laws for the regulation of the Plymouth, Devonport and Stonehouse Union Mechanics Institute. But those attending from Plymouth were not moved, literally. The arguments in favour of a united society," said Rowe, "embracing the three towns, were outweighed by the consideration of the inconvenience which must arise from the distance of the lecture and reading rooms in Devonport, which would be severely felt by artisans who wish to attend them after their daily labours. So Plymouth went alone." Rowe adds, "It having been thought highly desirable that the Mechanics Institute should be formed in this borough, distinct from that already established at Devonport, a public meeting was held at the Guildhall on the 2nd of May for the purpose of deliberating upon the propriety of the proposed measure. The Plymouth Mechanics Institute was thenceforth established as a separate society," says Rowe. "A committee of 24, 7 of whom were declared competent to act, and a treasurer and secretary were appointed." The North Devon Journal of Friday the 27th of May 1825 said it was Richard Burnett, a draper and engineer of Devonport, draper and engineer of Devonport, in conjunction with George Harvey, who were chiefly instrumental in establishing the institute. It had 130 members, and the Earl of Morley sent a donation of £5, just over £360 in today's terms, and Burnet 15 volumes of useful books. Interestingly, Burnet was a founding vice president of the Devonport and Stonehouse Mechanics Institute, now missing the word Plymouth in its title. He offered to loan 150 volumes to that organisation. The proposed united body soon came to be known as the Devonport Mechanics Institute. It closed in 1838, reopened in 1845, and folded finally in 1881. The building it occupied is still there in Duke Street. A short-lived Mechanics Institute was formed in Stonehouse in 1845 as part of a later wave of the movement. However, it did not meet with success and closed in 1853. Burnet, who published A Word to the Members of the Mechanics Institutes in 1826, later moved to Covent Garden in 1850, where his firm became a top-flight supplier of scenery and costumes. Harvey, who was a fellow of the Royal Society, the Royal Astronomical Society, the Geological Society, and the Linnean Society, was among the ablest mathematicians of his time, according to the Literary Gazette, and a friend of Charles Babbage. Shortly after being appointed one of the masters of the Royal Military Academy, Woolwich, in October 1834, Harvey returned to Plymouth and hanged himself with a silk handkerchief in the cellar of his home. The Plymouth Mechanics Institute was formed on the 30th of May 1825 and met first in the Guildhall, where they used one of the rooms for a library. The Guildhall was the mechanics' first home thanks to the mayor, Edmund Lockyer. Lockyer Street is named after him, and he was involved in the building of the Theatre Royal, the Royal Hotel, and also public baths and libraries. He was the father of Dr. Edmund Lockyer, who was a founding member of the Plymouth Institution in 1812 and a president in 3 of the first 4 years. It was Lockyer Jr. who laid the foundation stone of the Royal Theatre, Assembly Rooms and Hotel on Tuesday, September the 10th, 1811. The inaugural address was delivered on the 7th of November, 1825 by Dr. J. Collier Cookworthy. Like Dr. Lockyer, he was a founding member of the Plymouth Institution and a president in its first year. Attendances grew quickly at the Guildhall, and after 2 sessions, the mechanics found a need for a building of their own. An early press report said, "The institution consists of about 130 members who are admitted to the privileges of the society by quarterly payments of 3 shillings 3 pence. The library is open on Tuesday and Friday from 8 to 10 in the evening and contains about 1,000 volumes. Lectures are regularly delivered on Wednesdays from November to April inclusive. Strangers are admitted by payment of 1 shilling per lecture. Several classes, including chemical, French, and drawing classes, meet here for mutual improvement." Edmund Lockyer Sr., as president of the Mechanics Institute, was invited to lay the foundation stone of the building in Princess Square at the corner of Westwell Street on Monday the 5th of February 1827. By this time, membership of the Institute had grown to 290. Lockyer Sr., who would outlive his son by 20 years, was described by our very own Henry Woolcombe as of low origin, but got rich by being a government contractor. Historian Crispin Gill says this was by handling the disposal of prize ships and cargoes. The architect of the mechanics' new home was John Fulston, the man who gave us the original Athenaeum building in George Street and the Royal Hotel complex, amongst many others. The cost of construction was paid for entirely by the near 300 members, assisted by Charles Greaves's donation of £100. Greaves was one of 4 vice presidents of the newly established Mechanics Institute and donated to it numerous books from his private collection. Its facilities and purposes were for the voluntary association of mechanics and others, and the payment of a small weekly sum, donations of money, books, specimens, implements, models, and apparatus, a library of reference, a circulating library, and a reading room, a museum of machines, models, minerals, and natural history, lectures on natural and experimental philosophy, practical mechanics, astronomy, chemistry, literature, and the arts, an experimental workshop and laboratory originating with the members. Their new home opened on Wednesday, the 5th of December, 1827, and according to the Exeter and Plymouth Gazette, it was splendid. The Gazette reported that Dr. Cookworthy gave an introductory lecture. With Lockyer Senior in the chair, Cookworthy lectured on the advantage of early education and the object of the Institute, according to the North Devon Journal. Early topics under discussion included a Mr. Treby lecturing on geometry and its application to the sciences in December 1825. The Western Times and the Exeter and Plymouth Gazette on the 28th of June 1828 reported that Lieutenant Goldsmith RN, who had apparently acquired some celebrity a few years before, removing the famous Cornish Logan stone, had just finished a course of lectures at the Mechanics Institute on the progress of nautical astronomy and practical navigation. This seems to be the Logan Rock near Treen in Cornwall, an example of a Logan or rocking stone. Although it weighs some 80 tons, it was dislodged in 1824 by a group of British seamen intent on showing what the Navy could do. However, following complaints from local residents for whom the rock had become a tourist attraction and a source of income, the seamen were forced to restore it to its traditional location. On September the 20th, 1828, Mr. Bird gave the 3rd and final lecture of his series on astronomy to a crowded audience, and it was described by the Western Times as useful and pleasing. In October and November of that year, John Bryant Lane's great historical picture, Vision of Joseph, directing him to flee into Egypt, painted in Rome, was exhibited at the Institute with the entrance 1 shilling, explanation 6 pence, and season ticket 2 shillings. The Western Times said the painting earned the artist the ban of the Inquisition. In January 1829, Dr. Black lectured on the human mind, its powers and faculties. In 1830, Mr. Brinley lectured on architecture and C. Johns on botany. The Western Times also reported that bookseller Joseph Vale from London most respectively informs the nobility and gentry of Plymouth and its vicinity that he is now selling at the Mechanics Institution, Princess Square, the most superb collection of books on the fine arts ever offered for sale in this town, and he wasn't short on self-promotion either. In 1832, it played host to the Trinitarian Bible Society, auctions for a tenement and 5 dwelling houses, and political meetings, including the freeman of the borough and general election candidate John Collier, MD. The Committee of Trades organised a public welcome on Thursday, the 22nd of March, 1837, at the Mechanics Institute for the return to Britain of 4 of the 6 Tolpuddle martyrs, James Lovelace, James Brine, and Thomas and John Stanfield, when they were pardoned and returned to England, having arrived in Plymouth in that year of 1837. The Devon and Cornwall Natural History Society, which was formed in May 1838, held its inaugural address and first meetings at the Mechanics Institute in that month, before later moving to the Royal Union Baths. This was the 3rd of the organisations that would form the association we know today as the Plymouth Athenaeum. The British Association for the Advancement of Science annual meeting came to Plymouth in 1841, and the Mechanics Institute would be among the hosts, as were the Athenaeum and the Royal Union Baths. Section C, Geology and Physical Geography, was held at the Mechanics Institute, the meetings of which are the best attended of the whole, said the Times. It was here that Professor Richard Owen, the controversial first director of the Natural History Museum and one of Charles Darwin's most bitter opponents on the subject of evolution by natural selection, read for almost 2.5 hours part 2 of his report on the state of our knowledge of fossil reptiles. Although he didn't utter the word dinosaur in Plymouth, he added it to his written report, which was published a year later, much against the convention of the time for the verbatim reporting of talks. The Times described Owen's presentation as of very long detail, a trap that I hope I haven't fallen into this evening. Well, not yet, at least. Topics of contemporary relevance to our own times were aired at the Mechanics Institute. Viscount Ebrington, in December 1845, discussed the unhealthiness of towns, its causes and remedies, a problem we are still seeking to remedy nearly 180 years later. However, as happens to many organisations, the mechanics flourished initially and then faced challenges. Lectures were well attended in the early years, but membership later dwindled. In response, in 1848, the mechanics extended their range of activities and women were admitted. It was such a success that by 1850, the mechanics had 750 members, a total we could only dream of now. George Whittick, architect and associate of Falston, preferred to lecture at the Mechanics Institute rather than at the Athenaeum, where women apparently added colour at the mechanics. He wrote later, "The Athenaeum at that time presented nothing but grave visages of critics in black, bent on self-regarding reserve and keen scrutiny." Yeah. In 1850, the mechanics, keen to improve and expand their facilities, suggested a merger with the Plymouth Institution, now as we know known as the Athenaeum. Our transactions of 1858-59 tell the story. The Mechanics Institute proposal was to demolish the present building and erect a large and handsome hall with suitable adjuncts in its place, occupying the whole of our ground. One can only imagine the shock of such a radical suggestion and the thought of admitting women as members. The tale continues. The proposition was moved by Mr. Alfred Rooker and Mr. Colley, discussed and negatives. Opinion was then and would still remain divided on the question. On the one hand, assuming the union of the three kindred societies, obviously including the Devon and Cornwall Natural History Society, the measure would doubtless have embraced a broad and liberal foundation, would have been a fit representative of the intellect and mind of our rapidly increasing population, and by engaging the whole literary and scientific force of the town, would have been worthy to command popular support. It was contended that this society, by the adoption of an extended basis, would be acting more in the spirit of the original founders than by rigidly preserving its ancient mould, which was no longer appreciated in the altered circumstances of the times. The transactions report went on. On the other hand, it was apprehended that the accession to this society of a body of gentlemen who avowed the expediency of following rather than of leading public taste might endanger the grave objects of the founders and result in the establishment of an institution in which the element of amusement would predominate over intellectual instruction and mental energy. Dr. Moore, Athenaeum secretary, was quoted in the Western Courier, West of England Conservative, Plymouth and Devonport Advertiser as saying, the difference is explained between the Mechanics Institute and the Plymouth Institution, as the lecturers were considered to be professors or persons who had devoted their whole study to the subject on which they lectured on the former body, whereas with the latter, they were members of their own society, who met persons who had equal opportunities of obtaining knowledge and discussing the subjects brought before them. Trying to decipher Dr. Moore's comments, perhaps they can be viewed as the mechanics were lectured to by mere professionals or specialists, whereas the gentlemen of the Athenaeum lectured with each other. Wittig, who had been president of the Athenaeum in 1848-49, held that position with the Mechanics Institute at the time of the merger talks, and Rooker was a vice president of the Mechanics and would become president of the Athenaeum in 1852-53, following the merger with the Devon and Cornwall Natural History Society in 1851. With feet in both camps, they must have been frustrated by the failure of the union between the Athenaeum and the Mechanics. Wittig's membership of the Athenaeum ceased in 1851, and he retired to Bristol in July of that year, having stood down from the Mechanics Institute, attributing his departure to ill health. But was the failed union of the institutions connected to his departure from Plymouth, or was it a legacy project he had tried to achieve before heading to Bristol? He was awarded honorary membership of the Athenaeum in his absence in 1856. Rebuffed, the mechanics looked to expansion through rebuilding their own premises. On the 9th of May 1850, the Western Courier et al. Reported the members of the Mechanics Institute determined to erect a new building upon the site of the present, the principal hall of which will be capable of seating 1,000 or accommodating, in case of necessity, 1,200. There would be commodious classrooms and a library underneath. The design by Messrs. Wittig and Damant. The estimated costs were about £2,500. That's around £260,000 in today's terms. The foundation stone was raised on the 11th of July 1851 in the presence of the Mayor, J. Moore. Their existing building was demolished, and during construction, activities were continued at the Freemasons' Hall in Cornwall Street and Plymouth Theatre, according to the Western Courier, and the Lyceum Theatre in Westwell Street. Delays in the construction were attributed to the unavailability of plasterers due to the number of new houses being built, reported the Courier. The new premises, estimated to be worth around £8,000, were formally opened on Wednesday the 10th of September 1851. They boasted a lecture hall capable of seating 1,200 people, for which it was said to be at capacity that evening, a library with 8,000 volumes, reading rooms, and 6 other rooms. Letters of congratulation from Charles Dickens and Sir Edward Bulwer Lytton, the politician and author, arrived. The inaugural address on the history of the Mechanics Institution was given by the Reverend W.J. Odgers, a Unitarian minister and vice president of the organisation. Other speakers included MPs Roundell Palmer, later First Earl of Selborne, and Viscount Ebrington. With membership at 750 and increasing during the winter months by as many as 400, things looked rosy for the mechanics. They continued to thrive in their new building, and by 1860 their membership stood at 1,157. Despite the failed merger, there remained individuals who connected the mechanics and the Athenaeum. A number of Athenaeum luminaries lectured at the Mechanics Institute. Sir William Snow Harris, inventor of the lightning conductors for ships system, was one of them. It was Snow Harris, lecturing at the Mechanics Institute, who inspired a very youthful Jonathan Nash Herder in his electrical research. When he was 23, Herder was blinded while experimenting with explosive compounds, but did not allow this to stop him from working. Herder, who invented an electrical telegraph system and contributed a lot of research toward the development of the induction coil, gave his first course of lectures at the Mechanics Institute, aged just 16. Having joined the Plymouth Institution in 1833, Herder was curator of apparatus for many years and vice president from 1857 through to 1862. He was also a member of the Natural History Society while it existed independently. Herder was one of the great showman scientists of the age. He believed entertainment could be used to promote the spread of popular scientific understanding. It would eventually get him into hot water with the Mechanics Institute. For an ironic comparison with our activities since occupying our current home in 1961, the lecture hall at the Mechanics Institute found use as a performing arts venue. In April 1859, P.T. Barnum, the American showman remembered for promoting hoaxes and for founding the Barnum and Bailey Circus, addressed the Mechanics Institute on the science of money-making. Certainly his own, anyway. According to Jill Sullivan in Popular Exhibitions, Science and Showmanship, 1840 to 1910, Herder effectively combined his role as a leading light in Plymouth's learned societies with the educative opportunities afforded by the growth of popular entertainment and rational recreation. But populism also provoked resentment. Sullivan adds, much hand-wringing and heated debate followed in the Plymouth press, accentuated by a public argument between Herder and the committee of the Mechanics Institute. She says, an editorial bemoaned the fact that the Mechanics Institute had departed from the initial aims of experimental illustration and, through its concerts, readings, comic lectures, and semi-theatrical exhibitions, was now devoted to the promiscuous multitude, eagerly seeking excitement and recreation, totally irrespective of any salutary results. It goes on, it complained that scientific lecturers were poorly remunerated for their work and that the committee would happily pay 5 to 6 guineas for a dozen songs, but only 3 guineas for an elaborate scientific lecture that may have taken days or weeks of preparation. And I think with 1 or 2 exceptions like Brian Cox, that probably still applies today. And we can add to that. During the present quarter, the Plymouth Mechanics Institute was accused of having spent £100 on musical bookings, while only £6 to £7 on hiring scientific lecturers, including a gratuitous lecture from Herder. The conflict between the performing arts, populism, and serious study seems to foreshadow our experiences a century later. Elizabeth Cavici from the Dibner Institute for the History of Science and Technology at MIT says that Herder and the Mechanics Institute came to loggerheads over program content and funds. In a shouting match, the Mechanics chairman called Herder a coward, fool, liar, and dishonest man. And it was said that Mr. Herder, whose voice, as on most occasions, was more than a match for those opposed to it. Herder sought vindication in the press, alleging the chairman was shielded by my misfortune. Otherwise, he would not have dared say such things while others stood silent, incognito as far as I was concerned, letting abuse go on. In 1890, we know that John Frederick Winnicott of Messrs. Winnicott Brothers was the honorary secretary, and Mr. Joseph Foster, a member at the Athenaeum, was the curator of the Mechanics Institute. The institute was open from 3 to 5 and 7 to 10 p.m., except then when there were lectures taking place. The newsroom was open from 9 a.m. to 10 p.m. However, by the late 1890s, the mechanics' fortunes were plagued by falling attendances. Members were warned in 1897 that unless fortunes changed, they would be forced to sell their premises. In 1898, one old member observed in the Western Morning News that young people were now more interested in cricket, football, and cycling, etc. Again, similar sentiments that are often aired a century or so later, if not for football and cricket, but maybe for esports and such things. On the 1st of July, 1898, their members voted to wind up the Mechanics Institute and approached the Athenaeum again about an amalgamation. On the 6th of December, their building in Princess Square went under the auctioneer's hammer, selling for £5,400 to Reginald Watts, partner in solicitor's firm Watts, Ward and Anthony, who by that time occupied part of the building. Negotiations carried on into 1899, and by March of that year, a proposal was ready to be put before the two organisations. The mechanics approved the union at a meeting on the 29th of March, 1899. The Athenaeum followed at its annual general meeting on the 6th of April. The Athenaeum's transactions of that year tell us of an offer made by the trustees of the Mechanics Institute on winding up and selling their property to hand over their funds to this institution, partly for the creation of a library and reading room of general literature, and partly for our general purposes. It was approved by the Institution Council and by members of the Mechanics Institute. Under the arrangement, 18 members, 49 associates and 101 lady associates came over to the Athenaeum. Fortunately, there was no extension to our name, otherwise we might have become the Plymouth Institution and Devon and Cornwall Natural History Society and Mechanics Institute. Our annual report for 1900 recorded, "We are now rejoicing in an arrangement by which, under a carefully drawn up convention, a union with the same body as in 1850 will, we believe, improve and strengthen our venerable society." In Athenaeum retrospect, it was reported that a trust fund was formed on the amalgamation with the Mechanics Institute, but that this was gradually exhausted in the first quarter of the 20th century. Alison Wilson, in her lecture to mark 150 years of the Athenaeum Society, said, "The other society brought in its many members and £2,000, and at once A.S. Parker was commissioned to plan further buildings at the Athenaeum. These were opened in 1901 by the Earl of Morley. There was a large reading room, lending library, committee room, offices and dark rooms with access from Athenaeum Street. The facade was in an unobtrusive style, not out of keeping with the main building." The Mechanics Institute's former home lived on as the building became the Princess Hall, and in 1915 it became the Plymouth Repertory Theatre, which survived until 1927. It continued as a theatre until 1926. Theatre would return to the unified organisation when the rebuilt Athenaeum opened in 1961, including a public entertainment auditorium. I am sure Jonathan Nash Herder would be chuckling at the irony of theatre and entertainment being housed on the once austere plot of the neoclassical Athenaeum. And I thank you, ladies and gentlemen.